I had given them everything, my savings, my house, my trust. And in the silence after the phone slipped from my hand, I finally understood. I hadn't been their father. I'd been their last deposit. Welcome back to your ultimate destination for gripping revenge stories, family betrayals, shocking betrayals, and emotional justice. Subscribe now and join a community and tell us where you're watching from. Turn on the notification bell for our next story. Are you ready to witness the ultimate payback? Let's get started. My name is Mr. ZAHA, and I am 68 years old. I say that plainly, without apology, because somewhere along the way, people started saying it like it was a warning. 68. Like the number itself explained something. Like it meant I couldn't read a contract, couldn't understand a balance sheet, couldn't tell the difference between love and a long con. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where all honest stories start. Not at the betrayal, but before it. Back when the mornings still felt like mine. I wake up every day at 5:47 a.m. Not because an alarm tells me to. Not because I have somewhere urgent to be. I wake up because for 41 years, that was the time the ZAHA Lumber and Hardware Warehouse opened its loading dock, and my body never got the memo that I sold the business. My feet hit the hardwood floor, my joints crack like old timber, and for exactly 3 seconds, I am still the man I used to be, strong-backed, purposeful, needed. Then the silence reminds me. The house on Clover Ridge Drive is a 4-bedroom colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch that my late wife, Dorothy, insisted on. She said a porch was a promise that you were the kind of people who sat outside and waved at neighbors, who had nothing to hide and nowhere better to be. Dorothy died 4 years ago, a Tuesday in November, and I have kept every piece of furniture exactly where she left it, including the reading chair by the window where she spent her last good months watching the Cardinals at the feeder. I make coffee in the same percolator we bought at a Sears in 1987. I drink it black, standing at the kitchen window, watching the sun come up over the ridge. I eat 2 eggs, scrambled, with wheat toast. I read the actual newspaper, the physical one, folded in thirds the way my father taught me. This is my life now. And for a long time, I told myself it was enough. What kept it from being lonely, what I believe kept it from being lonely, was Julianne, my daughter, my only child. She was born on a rainy April morning when the dogwoods were just starting to bloom, and I remember standing in that hospital hallway with my heart so full I thought my chest would give out. Dorothy had squeezed my hand and said, "She looks like trouble." And she did. Even then, 6 pounds and 11 ounces, Julianne had this expression like she was already calculating the room. We raised her well. I believe that with everything in me. Good schools, family dinners, church on Sundays. Dorothy read to her every night until Julianne was old enough to tell her she didn't need it anymore. We gave her independence because we believed independence was a gift. We gave her confidence because we believed confidence was armor. What we didn't anticipate was that armor, in the wrong hands, could become a weapon. She married Michael Hargrove 3 years after Dorothy passed. I walked her down the aisle in the same church where Dorothy and I had said our vows, and I cried the whole way. Not sad tears, at least, that's what I told myself. Michael was a financial advisor, sharp dresser, firm handshake. The kind of man who smiled at exactly the right moment, who laughed at your jokes just a half second after everyone else, like he was calculating whether it was worth the energy. Dorothy would not have trusted him. I know that now. Dorothy had a gift for seeing through polish. But Dorothy was gone, and I was a 66-year-old widower, trying very hard not to become a burden to the daughter I loved more than my own heartbeat. That is the thing nobody tells you about grief. It doesn't just take the person. It takes your judgment. It hollows out the part of you that used to know when something was wrong, and it fills that space with need. Need for connection, need for family, need to believe that the people still standing are the ones worth standing for. Michael started coming around more after the wedding. Always with a reason. Always with paperwork. The first time, it was about estate planning. Reasonable enough. He sat at my kitchen table with a leather portfolio and explained, very patiently, that a man with my assets needed proper documentation. A will update. A power of attorney, just in case. A healthcare directive. He used words like legacy and protecting what you've built and making things easier for Julianne. I signed. The second time, it was about the property on Miller Creek Road, 40 acres of wooded land I'd been holding for 20 years, land Dorothy and I had planned to build a cabin on someday. Michael explained that the land was an underperforming asset, that the property taxes were eroding its value, that if I transferred it into a family trust he managed, it would be protected and eventually benefit everyone. I signed. There were others. A third visit about a brokerage account restructuring. A fourth about the deed to Clover Ridge Drive. Just a title adjustment, he said, for tax purposes, nothing that changed anything materially, just paperwork really. I signed. And I signed because Julianne was always there. Sitting at my table, drinking my coffee, touching my arm at the right moments. Calling me daddy in that voice she's had since she was 4 years old. The voice that made everything feel okay. She'd look at me with those eyes that were so much like Dorothy's and say, "This is the smart thing, Dad. Michael knows what he's doing. You trust me, don't you?" And I did. God help me, I did. The morning the phone call happened, it was an ordinary Thursday. October, the leaves turning, the air with that particular chill that always made me want to call Dorothy and tell her to put a sweater on, and then remember, and feel the loss like something freshly broken. Julianne had called at 10:15. We talked about Thanksgiving plans, about her friend Carla's new baby, about whether I needed a new water heater. Normal things. Mother hen things, the kind of conversation that felt like being cared for. I was standing on the back porch with my coffee cup, feeling the sun on my face, feeling, I am not ashamed to say, grateful. Grateful that I still had her. That the family hadn't completely scattered when Dorothy left. I was about to say goodbye. I had actually pulled the phone from my ear, was reaching to press the red button. And that's when I heard it. She hadn't hung up. She must have thought she had. Or maybe she turned away from the phone, and her voice carried. That voice I had known for 42 years, that voice I had held onto through the worst years of my life. Michael. He signed everything. Every single document we brought him. A pause. A male laugh. Low. Satisfied. And then Julianne again, her voice bright with something I had never heard in it before and hope never to hear again. I know. What an old fool. The phone slipped from my hand and hit the porch railing before I caught it. I stood there in the October sun and felt the world rearrange itself around me. Not dramatically, not with noise, just quietly, the way the most devastating things happen, a slow cold settling into the chest, a recalibration of everything you thought you knew. I stood there for a long time. The cardinals were at Dorothy's feeder, a pair of them, the bright red male and the brown female, and they didn't care at all about what had just happened. They just kept eating. The sun kept moving. The leaves kept falling from the big oak at the corner of the yard, the one Dorothy used to call our old man tree. I set my coffee cup down very carefully on the railing. And for the first time in 4 years, I started to think clearly. This is just the beginning of Mr. ZAHA's story, and already, the ground is shifting. Drop a comment below. Did you feel that moment when the phone slipped? What were you feeling when you heard what Julianne said? Tell me your thoughts. I read every single one. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect a man in my position to crumble, to sink into a kitchen chair with his face in his hands, to let the grief take him the way water takes a low place in the road, completely, inevitably, without resistance. And maybe 30 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, I would have. Maybe the version of me that existed before 41 years of running a business, before burying a wife, before learning that the hardest thing in this life isn't failure, but the particular loneliness of loving people who don't love you back the same way. Maybe that version would have broken right there on the back porch. But I am Mr. ZAHA. I am 68 years old. And I have learned, slowly and at great cost, that the moments that change your life don't announce themselves with thunder. They come quietly. They come in October sunlight, in the sound of cardinals at a feeder, in a daughter's laughter traveling through a phone you haven't quite hung up yet. I stood on that porch for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the back wall through the kitchen window, the old rooster clock Dorothy bought at an estate sale in Chattanooga in 2003, the one with the cracked face she refused to replace because she said a clock with a cracked face had more character than a perfect one. 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, I did not rage. I did not pace. I stood very still, and I let the truth arrive like weather, slow at first, then all at once. I thought about the land on Miller Creek Road. 40 acres I had walked with my father when I was 12 years old, land that had been in my family since before I could remember, land where Dorothy and I had once spread a blanket on a Sunday afternoon and talked about growing old together. Gone. I thought about the brokerage account. The one I'd built over 23 years, contribution by contribution. The account that was supposed to be the foundation of a comfortable final chapter. Restructured, Michael had said. Protected, he had said. I thought about the deed to Clover Ridge Drive. My home. Dorothy's home. The house with the wraparound porch and the reading chair by the window and the rooster clock with the cracked face. And I thought about my daughter sitting at my kitchen table, her hand on my arm, her eyes soft, saying, "You trust me, don't you, Daddy?" On the 12th minute, I went inside and made a phone call. Not to Julianne. Not to Michael. I called a man named Gerald Beaumont. Gerald is 73 years old, semi-retired, and for 35 years he was the finest estate and contract attorney in Millbrook County. We had gone to the same church, sat in the same Sunday school class, watched our daughters play in the same Little League games in fields that don't exist anymore. When Dorothy was sick, Gerald had driven to the hospital 3 times just to sit with me in the waiting room and not say anything, because he understood that sometimes a man doesn't need words, he needs company. I trusted Gerald the way you trust old wood, not because it looks impressive, but because it has already proven it won't give way. He answered on the second ring. "Marcus," he said. "He's one of the 3 people left on earth who calls me by my first name." "Gerald," I said, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to pull every document I've signed in the last 18 months and tell me exactly what I gave away." A pause. Gerald Beaumont did not ask unnecessary questions. "How soon?" he said. "Yesterday," I said. "I'll call you by 4 o'clock." I hung up and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Michael had spread his leather portfolio, where Julianne had touched my arm, where I had signed my name over and over like a man who had nothing left to protect. And I sat with the silence for a while. The thing about betrayal, the thing they never tell you, is that it doesn't come alone. It brings everything with it. It walks in the door and it brings every moment you misread, every warning you dismissed, every quiet voice in the back of your mind you told to hush because you wanted so badly to believe in something. Betrayal is not just about what happened. It is about every moment you chose not to see it coming. I thought about a Sunday dinner, maybe 6 months ago. I had made pot roast, Dorothy's recipe, the one with the carrots and the pearl onions, and Julianne and Michael had come over. We'd sat at this same table and I'd felt so full. Full of food, full of family, full of the illusion that things were fine, that I was fine, that the house was still a home instead of an asset someone was waiting to collect. Michael had asked me, over dessert, whether I'd ever thought about downsizing. Moving into one of those senior communities, he'd said, the nice ones, the ones with the activity centers and the medical staff on site. Very casually, like it was a thought that had just occurred to him. I had laughed it off, said I wasn't ready for a rocking chair yet. He had smiled, just smiled and nodded and moved on to another subject. I understood that smile now. By noon I had done something else. I had driven to Millbrook Savings and Loan, the small regional bank where I had kept a personal checking account for 30 years, an account Michael didn't know about, an account I'd never mentioned because it had seemed too modest to bother discussing. Never more than a few $1,000s, the kind of rainy day money a man keeps folded in a coffee, can because his father taught him that you always keep something they can't see. My father had been a practical man. I spoke with Karen Elledge, the branch manager, who had known me since she was a teller 20 years ago. I told her I needed to understand the full picture of what I currently owned, legally and unambiguously, and I needed that information in writing. Karen looked at me for a moment with the careful expression of someone who understood that I was not asking a simple question, and then she said she'd have everything ready by the end of the day. I drove home. I ate a sandwich standing over the sink because I didn't want to sit at the kitchen table again. Not yet. At 3:52 p.m., Gerald called. "Marcus," he said, and I could hear it in his voice, that particular weight that comes into a man's voice when he is about to say something he wishes he didn't have to say. "I've been through everything. Do you want the summary first, or the details?" "Summary," I said. A breath. The property on Miller Creek Road was transferred to a limited liability company, Hardrow Family Holdings, 14 months ago. The deed on Clover Ridge Drive was placed in a revocable trust with Michael listed as sole trustee, which in practical terms means he controls all decisions about the property. The brokerage account was consolidated into a managed portfolio under Hardrow Financial, with you listed as a beneficiary rather than the account holder. I set my hand flat on the kitchen counter, pressed it down, felt the cool solidity of the tile. What does that mean, Gerald? Plain language. It means, Gerald said carefully, that on paper, Marcus, you own very little of what you thought you owned. It means that if Michael chose to act against your interests, if he sold the land, refinanced the house, liquidated the portfolio, he could do so legally. The documents you signed gave him that authority. Can it be undone? Another pause. Longer this time. Some of it, possibly. The revocable trust has provisions we could challenge, particularly given that the circumstances of signing could suggest undue influence, meaning that your emotional state following your wife's passing and your relationship of trust with your daughter could be used to argue that you didn't sign with full informed consent. The LLC transfer is harder. But Marcus, he stopped. Say it, Gerald. If this goes where I think it might go, it's going to get ugly. These things always do. And it will require you to make a decision about what you're willing to do to your relationship with your daughter to get back what is yours. I looked out the kitchen window at Dorothy's cardinal feeder. The birds were gone now. The sun was lower, the light thin and golden, the oak tree casting long shadows across the yard. My relationship with my daughter, I said slowly, may have already made its decision without me. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll start drafting a formal assessment. I'll have it to you by Monday. And Marcus, don't sign anything else. Not a receipt, not a birthday card with legal language, not so much as a sticky note. Nothing. Understood. And one more thing. Yes. Don't let them know you know. Not yet. Can you do that? I thought about Julianne's voice. What an old fool. I thought about every Sunday dinner, every arm touch, every soft-eyed daddy that I now had to reconsider from the beginning. Yes, I said. I can do that. I hung up the phone. I went to the living room and sat in Dorothy's reading chair, the one I hadn't sat in since she died, the one I'd kept as a kind of monument, a kept promise. I sat in it, and I looked at the empty cardinal feeder through the window, and I let myself feel, for just a few minutes, the full weight of what had happened. Not the legal weight, not the financial weight, the weight of 42 years of love that had apparently been running a tab I didn't know about. I am not a man given to self-pity. My father didn't raise one, and neither did life. But I will tell you honestly that in that chair, in that golden late afternoon October light, I allowed myself one moment of complete and unguarded grief. Not for the land, not for the money, not even for the house. I grieved for the version of my daughter I had believed in. The little girl in the hospital on a rainy April morning. The teenager who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives. The young woman I had walked down an aisle believing I was giving her to someone worthy. I grieved for that, and then I put it away. Because grief, I have learned, is a place to visit, not a place to live. When the light finally failed and the kitchen went dark, I stood up from Dorothy's chair and I turned on the lights. And then I began to plan. Mr. ZAHA didn't cry. He planned. Does that hit different? Comment below. What were you feeling when Gerald laid out what was really gone? And what do you think Mr. ZAHA should do next? Drop your thoughts. I want to know. There is a particular kind of strength that only comes from having nothing left to lose. Not the reckless, burning strength of a young man with his whole life ahead of him and no real understanding of consequences. Not the desperate strength of someone cornered and swinging. I mean the deep, still, absolutely clear-eyed strength that settles into a man when he has already absorbed the worst of it, when the shock has passed and the grief has had its moment, and what remains is simply the truth, clean and cold and workable. That is where I live for the next 3 weeks. I did not call Julianne. I did not change my routine. I woke at 5:47, made my coffee, read my newspaper, stood at the kitchen window watching the ridge. I did everything exactly as I always had, because the most important thing I could do in those first weeks was appear to be the man they believed I was, the old fool who had signed everything and didn't know the difference. Let them believe that. The performance was not difficult. That surprised me at first. I had expected it to feel like lying, to sit in my stomach the wrong way. But it didn't. What it felt like was documentation. Every ordinary Thursday phone call with Julianne, every casual question about Thanksgiving, every moment she called me daddy in that voice, I filed it. Not with anger, not even with sadness anymore. Just filed it away, the way a man files receipts for a transaction he intends to dispute. On the Friday following Gerald's call, I drove to see him at his office on Pemberton Street. His office smelled like old paper and coffee and the particular mustiness of a room where serious things had been decided for a long time. Gerald had the documents spread across his conference table, annotated in red pen, flagged with color-coded tabs. We sat across from each other and went through everything methodically. The picture that emerged was more deliberate than I had initially allowed myself to believe. The documents hadn't been gathered randomly or opportunistically. They had been assembled in a sequence, a specific, calculated sequence designed to move assets out of my direct control in stages small enough that no single transaction would raise a flag. The power of attorney had come first, establishing Michael's legal authority. Then the trust deed for the house, which locked the property under his management. Then the Miller Creek land transfer, moving it into the LLC entirely. Then the brokerage consolidation, which repositioned me from owner to beneficiary. A word that sounds generous until you understand that a beneficiary has no authority, only eligibility, and eligibility can be revoked. This was planned, I said. Not a question. Gerald nodded. The sequencing is too precise to be accidental. Someone, and I would argue someone with financial and legal training, mapped this out. Each document was timed to avoid triggering mandatory review thresholds. Each one, individually, looks like routine estate planning. Together, he tapped the spread of papers with one finger. Together they tell a different story. How long? I said. How long do you think this was in motion before they came to me with the first document? Gerald looked at me steadily. Based on the LLC filing date for Hargrove Family Holdings? At least 8 months before they brought you the first paper to sign. 8 months. I did the math without wanting to. 8 months before the first document meant the planning started approximately 4 months after Dorothy died. 4 months after I buried my wife, while I was still sleeping in a house that smelled like her perfume and eating meals I didn't taste and going through the motions of living because stopping felt like a betrayal of her memory. During that time, in some other house across town, my son-in-law had been opening a laptop and building a legal architecture designed to take everything from me. And my daughter had known. That was the part one kept returning to in the quiet hours. Not Michael. Michael had never pretended to be anything other than a man who measured the world in columns of numbers. But Julianne had sat in this office, Gerald had told me, as a co-signer on 2 of the documents. She had not been a bystander. She had been a participant. I asked Gerald what our options were. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands and gave me the honest accounting of a man who had been doing this for 4 decades and had no interest in offering false comfort. The power of attorney could be revoked immediately and unilaterally. That was straightforward. I simply had to file a revocation, and Michael's legal authority over my affairs would end. The trust deed for the house was more complex, but because it was structured as a revocable trust, there was a legal pathway to challenge it, particularly if we could demonstrate that the signing circumstances involved undue influence, which, given that it had been signed 9 months after Dorothy's death by a grieving widower at the request of his daughter and son-in-law, was not an unreasonable argument to make. The Miller Creek land was harder. The LLC transfer was a completed transaction. Unwinding it would require either proving fraud, which meant a higher legal bar and a longer timeline, or negotiating a voluntary transfer back, which meant having a conversation I had not yet decided how to have. The brokerage account was somewhere in between. Bottom line, I said. Bottom line, Gerald said, is that you can recover most of this. Not all of it, maybe not quickly, and not without a fight. But the legal foundation for a strong challenge exists. What I need from you is patience, documentation, and the willingness to be very uncomfortable for a period of time. I've been uncomfortable before, I said. Gerald almost smiled. I know you have, Marcus. We agreed on a strategy. First, I would quietly revoke the power of attorney, a filing that did not require notification to Michael, just a registration at the county clerk's office. Second, Gerald would prepare a formal legal brief documenting the pattern of transactions and their likely intent. Third, and this was the part that required the most careful management, we would wait. Wait for what? I asked. For them to make a move, Gerald said. If this was planned the way I think it was planned, they're not finished. There may be another document coming, or an action, a refinancing, a sale, something. When they move again, they'll confirm the pattern, and that confirmation is what turns a civil dispute into a much stronger legal case. I understood. I was the bait. That suited me fine. The call came on a Wednesday evening, 16 days after I had stood on the back porch and heard my daughter's laughter through a phone I hadn't quite hung up. Julianne. Warm, easy, her voice carrying that particular note of practiced cheerfulness she had developed over the past year. The voice she used when she was steering a conversation somewhere specific. Daddy, how are you? I've been thinking about you. Fine, I said. Eating well. Sleeping all right. Good, good. A pause, and I heard in that pause the slight recalibration of someone who had a script and was finding their place in it. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something. Michael's been looking at the property situation, and there's actually a really exciting opportunity. There's a developer, a very reputable company, who's expressed interest in the Miller Creek acreage. And the number they're talking about is significant, Daddy. It could really set things up nicely. I let a moment pass. Let the silence do the work. Set what up nicely? I said. Well, for you, of course. For your retirement. And honestly, that land has just been sitting there. You've never really used it. Your retirement. Your land. The language of possession, but the actions of transfer. That's interesting, I said, keeping my voice mild. What kind of number are we talking about? She told me. It was a real number, a substantial number, the kind of number designed to make an old man's eyes light up and his questions stop. I made a small impressed sound, the sound of a man who was considering it. Michael thinks we could have the paperwork together by the end of the month, she said. Nothing complicated. Just an authorization for the sale. Just an authorization. Just another document. Just another signature from the old fool who signed everything. Sure, I said. Have him put it together and bring it over. We can look at it over dinner. Really? And there it was, a note of surprise that she tried immediately to smooth over. She hadn't expected it to be quite that easy. Or maybe she had, and the surprise was something else. The tiny dissonance of a person who has told themselves a story about someone and then briefly, unguardedly, sees the reality underneath. Of course, I said. You know I trust your judgment, sweetheart. The word sweetheart cost me something. I paid it anyway. Wonderful, she said. Sunday dinner? I'll bring that cheesecake you like. I'll make the pot roast, I said. After I hung up, I called Gerald. They're moving on the Miller Creek land, I said. They want to sell it to a developer. They're bringing paperwork Sunday. Gerald was quiet for a moment. That's the move. Yes. All right. Don't sign anything Sunday. You can receive the documents, review them, even seem enthusiastic, but do not put your pen to paper. Tell them you want to read everything carefully first. That buys us time, and it's completely reasonable behavior. No one can argue that a man asking to read a contract before signing is doing anything wrong. And then Monday morning, we file. We file the POA revocation, we file the undue influence brief for the trust deed, and we send a formal letter to Hargrove Financial notifying them that the account management agreement is under legal review. All at once. All on the same day. Like cutting the legs out, I said. All at once, Gerald confirmed. Before they have time to move any assets or accelerate any transactions. Speed matters here, Marcus. I sat with that for a moment. Gerald, I said. What happens to Julianne? A long pause. That, he said carefully, depends entirely on what she's willing to do when the table turns. If she cooperates, if she voluntarily assists in unwinding the transactions, then the legal exposure is manageable. If she doesn't, he paused again. Then we follow the evidence where it leads. I didn't say anything. Marcus, she made choices. You didn't make them for her. I know, I said. I know that. But knowing something and being at peace with it are two different countries. And that night I sat in Dorothy's chair for a long time, not thinking about legal strategies or asset transfers, but about a rainy April morning and a little girl who looked like trouble, and the way my chest had felt like it might give out from being too full. Sunday arrived the way difficult days always do, ordinary on the surface. October deepening into November now, the last of the leaves down, the yard bare and clean in that particular way that always reminded me that things ending was not the same as things being over. Julianne arrived at 4 o'clock with Michael and a grocery bag and the cheesecake she'd promised. She hugged me at the door the way she always did, her arms around my neck, her cheek against mine, and I held her for exactly as long as I always held her, because the performance had to be complete, and because, God help me, part of me still needed that hug to be real. Michael shook my hand in the doorway. Firm grip. Easy smile. The smile of a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered. We ate dinner at the kitchen table. The pot roast was good. Dorothy's recipe never failed. We talked about nothing significant. The weather turning, a co-worker of Julianne's who was getting married, a football game Michael cared about. I watched them both across the table and marveled, not for the first time, at how completely people can inhabit a version of reality that serves them. They believed I was their old fool. They believed I was happy. They believed this was a family dinner. After the cheesecake, Michael reached into the bag he'd brought and set the folder on the table with the practiced casualness of a man who had done this before and expected it to work the same way it always had. "So, Marcus," he said. He called me Marcus when he wanted to sound like an equal, ZAHA when he wanted to sound formal, and Dad when he wanted something. I put together the authorization documents for the Miller Creek transaction. Pretty straightforward. The developer is ready to move quickly, which is actually to our advantage, because... "Can I take a look?" I said. I took the folder. I opened it. I read. I am not a lawyer, but I am a man who spent 41 years reading contracts before signing them. And I had also, 3 days earlier, sat with Gerald Beaumont and gone through exactly what this document would likely contain and what each clause would mean in practical terms. What it meant, in practical terms, was that I would be authorizing the sale of the Miller Creek property for a sum that would go directly into Hargrove Family Holdings, the LLC that Michael controlled, with a distribution provision that entitled me to receive a portion of the proceeds at Michael's discretion at a timeline of his choosing. At his discretion, at his timeline. I looked up from the document. Julianne was watching me with those soft Dorothy eyes, her hand already drifting toward my arm on the table. Michael was smiling. I closed the folder. "This all looks really interesting," I said. "I'd like to take a couple of days to read through it carefully before I sign. You know how I am. Your mother always said I read everything twice." A flicker, just a flicker, across Michael's face. "There and gone." "Of course," he said smoothly. "Take your time. No rush." Julianne's hand found my arm. "Take all the time you need, Daddy." I smiled at her, and I thought, Monday morning, sweetheart. Monday morning. Mr. ZAHA is playing the longest game of his life, and he hasn't tipped his hand yet. Comment below right now. Were you holding your breath at that Sunday dinner? What would you have done sitting across that table? Tell me everything. Drop it in the comments. Monday morning arrived like a verdict. I woke at 5:47 as I always did, but this morning I did not stand at the kitchen window with my coffee in the unhurried way of a man with nowhere to be. This morning I showered, shaved, and put on the charcoal gray suit I had worn to every significant occasion of my adult life. The suit I wore when I signed the papers to open ZAHA Lumber and Hardware. The suit I wore when the business crossed its first million in revenue. The suit I wore when I buried Dorothy. It was my serious suit. My I mean what I am about to do suit. I ate my eggs. I drank my coffee. I read 3 pages of the newspaper and then folded it precisely and set it on the counter. At 8:15 a.m., I called Gerald. "Are you ready?" he said. "I have been ready," I said, "since October." At 9 a.m., Gerald filed the revocation of power of attorney at the Millbrook County Clerk's office. The filing took 11 minutes. With the stroke of a clerk's stamp, Michael Hargrove's legal authority over my affairs ceased to exist. At 9:23 a.m., Gerald's office sent a formal letter to Hargrove Financial Services via certified mail, return receipt requested, notifying them that the managed portfolio agreement was under legal review for potential fraud and undue influence, that all account activity was to be suspended pending resolution, and that any attempt to liquidate, transfer, or otherwise move assets within the account would be considered evidence of intent to defraud and reported to the State Financial Regulatory Board. At 9:45 a.m., Gerald filed the formal brief with the County Circuit Court initiating a legal challenge to the revocable trust deed on Clover Ridge Drive, citing undue influence, elder financial exploitation, and breach of fiduciary duty. At 10 a.m., I drove to Millbrook Savings and Loan and sat with Karen Elledge and transferred a significant portion of my accessible cash into a new account. Sole owner. No secondary signatories. No power of attorney provisions. No joint access of any kind. At 10:47 a.m., my phone rang. I was sitting in Karen's office when it rang, and I looked at the screen and saw Julianne's name, and I let it ring. It rang again at 10:53, and again at 11:06. At 11:14, Michael called. I let that ring too. I finished my business at the bank, thanked Karen, drove home, changed out of my serious suit, and hung it back in the closet with the care of a man who expects to need it again soon. Then I sat at the kitchen table and called Julianne back. She answered before the first ring finished. Dad. Her voice was different. Not the warm, practiced warmth of Sunday dinners and arm touches. Something underneath it had cracked open, and what was coming through the crack was something rawer, confusion, maybe, or the first cold touch of consequence. Julianne, I said. What's going on? Michael got a letter from. He says there's some kind of legal. Dad, what is this? Did someone contact you? Did someone tell you something? I let a moment pass. I need you to come over, I said. Both of you. This afternoon. Dad. This afternoon, Julianne. 3 o'clock. A silence. Longer than it should have been for a daughter who had nothing to hide. Okay, she said finally. We'll be there. I spent the hours between that call and 3 o'clock doing something I had not done in 4 years. I went through the boxes. Dorothy's boxes. The ones I had carried to the spare bedroom after she died and covered with a sheet because I couldn't look at them and couldn't bring myself to do anything else with them. 4 bankers' boxes, neatly labeled in her handwriting. Photos, letters, Marcus's business records, Julianne. I opened the one labeled Julianne. It was full of the careful, loving documentation of a mother's memory. Report cards, drawings from elementary school, lopsided houses and stick figures with enormous heads, labeled Mommy Daddy Julianne in the large, uncertain letters of a child who had not yet learned how permanent words could be. A corsage from Julianne's junior prom, dried to papery fragility inside a small plastic bag. A birthday card Julianne had made by hand when she was 7, crayon on construction paper. Happy birthday, Daddy. You are the best daddy in the world. I love you to the moon times a million. I held that card for a long time. I was not looking for ammunition. I was not looking for a weapon or a strategy or anything Gerald could file with the circuit court. I was looking for something else, something I needed to carry with me into that 3 o'clock meeting, something that would keep me from becoming a man I didn't want to be. I was looking for the reason this still mattered. Not the money, not the land, not the house. The reason it mattered that my daughter was the one who had done this. I found it in that card. I love you to the moon times a million. The crayon was purple, her favorite color when she was 7, and the letters were crooked and enormous and completely sincere. And somewhere between that construction paper card and the woman who had sat at my kitchen table guiding my hand toward a pen, something had gone terribly wrong, and I did not know yet whether the something was fixable, but I knew I needed to find out. Because Dorothy would not have wanted me to go to war with our daughter without first trying everything else. I put the card in my suit jacket pocket. They arrived at 3 o'clock exactly. Michael's car, a silver Mercedes that I had once complimented and now understood had been purchased with money that had once been mine in everything but legal paperwork, pulled into the driveway with the quiet precision of an expensive engine. I watched them from the front window. Watched Michael put the car in park and turn to Julianne and say something. His jaw tight, his hand making a short, sharp gesture that I recognized as the gesture of a man delivering instructions. Watched Julianne nod. Watched them compose themselves before opening the doors. They were putting on their own performance. I opened the front door before they knocked. Julianne looked, for just a moment, like the girl in that construction paper card. Something uncertain and young crossing her face before she assembled it back into the composed expression she'd been wearing lately. Michael looked the way he always looked, controlled, careful, already calculating. Come in, I said. We sat in the living room. I had not made coffee. I had not set out anything on the table. This was not a visit I intended to make comfortable. Michael sat forward on the couch with his elbows on his knees, a posture I recognized as his authority posture, the one he used when he wanted to seem reasonable and in charge simultaneously. Julianne sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving between Michael and me with an expression I had not seen on her since she was a teenager and had been caught in something she couldn't explain her way out of. Marcus, Michael said, I think there's been some kind of miscommunication. The letters we received this morning, they're concerning, and I think if we can just talk through this calmly, we can clear up whatever. Michael, I said. He stopped. I'm going to ask you to let me speak first, and I'm going to ask you to listen. Can you do that? A beat. He sat back slightly. Of course. I looked at Julianne. She looked back at me, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, I saw something in her face that was not performance. Something that flinched. On October 14th, I said, I was on the phone with you. We talked about Thanksgiving and Carla's baby and the water heater. And when I went to hang up, I heard something before the call ended. The color left Julianne's face. Not gradually. All at once, like a light being switched off. I heard you tell Michael that the old man had signed everything. And I heard you both laugh. And I heard you call me a fool. The living room went absolutely silent. Outside, a car passed on Clover Ridge Drive. A dog barked somewhere down the street. The rooster clock in the kitchen ticked. Michael opened his mouth. Don't, I said. Quietly. Without anger. The word landed like a closed door. Whatever you are about to say, Michael, don't. Because I have spent 3 weeks listening to Gerald Beaumont explain to me, document by document, exactly what the two of you have been doing for the past 18 months, and I am not in the mood for another performance. Michael closed his mouth. I kept my eyes on Julianne. I need to ask you something, I said. And I need you to understand that how you answer this question matters more to me than the land, more than the house, more than every document you put in front of me. It matters more than any of it. Julianne's hands were no longer folded neatly in her lap. They were pressed together, white at the knuckles. Why? I said. Not how. Not when. What? The silence stretched. Michael shifted beside her. I watched him make the calculation, whether to speak, whether to manage this, whether there was an angle. I watched him decide there wasn't one and go still. And Julianne, my daughter, my April morning girl, my moon times a million, looked at me and her face did something I had not seen it do in years. It broke open. Not the practiced softness of the arm touch and the daddy voice. Something real. Something that had apparently been under considerable pressure for some time and had finally found the crack it needed. It started as Michael's idea, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He said that the assets weren't being managed properly, that you didn't understand what things were worth, that if something happened to you, everything would just scatter. He said he was protecting it. Julianne, Michael said. No. She said it to him without looking at him. Just one word, flat and final, and something shifted in the room. A realignment, subtle but unmistakable, like tectonic plates deciding which way to settle. She looked back at me. Her eyes were wet. I told myself it was for you, she said. I told myself we were protecting your assets, managing things, that you were getting older and you needed. You told yourself I was a fool, I said. The words were not cruel. I said them the way you say a true thing, plainly, because plainness is sometimes the only kindness. She flinched. I told myself you wouldn't notice, that you'd be fine, that nothing would actually change for you day to day, that you'd still have the house and that it was just paperwork, just legal structure. Julianne. I leaned forward in my chair. Look at me. She looked at me. Your mother loved you more than she loved anything on this earth, I said. More than this house. More than that feeder she kept full of seed until the week she died. More than anything. And I loved you the same way. We didn't give you things to give you things. We gave you everything we had because we believed you were worth it. Because we believed you were the kind of person who understood what it meant when someone trusted you with everything they had. A tear broke free down her left cheek. I signed those documents, I said, because you asked me to. Not because I didn't understand them. Not because I was a fool. Because you are my daughter, and I trusted you. And there is no amount of money on this earth worth more to me than what that trust was. I reached into my jacket pocket, unfolded the construction paper card, set it on the coffee table between us. She looked down at it. The purple crayon letters, the crooked I love you to the moon times a million, and something in her completely collapsed. The sound she made was not elegant. It was the sound of a person who has been holding something terrible for a long time and has finally run out of the strength to hold it. She pressed both hands over her mouth and the tears came, and beside her, Michael sat very still with the expression of a man watching something he could not control and did not know how to process. I'm not here to destroy you, I said. I looked at Michael now, directly, without flinching. But I am not the man you believed you were dealing with. The power of attorney is revoked as of this morning. The trust deed and the portfolio are in legal dispute. Gerald Beaumont has enough documentation to take this as far as it needs to go. I held Michael's gaze. And it will go as far as it needs to go unless we reach an agreement. A real one, documented, overseen by counsel, that restores what was taken. Every piece of it. Michael said nothing for a long moment. I watched him calculate, watched him arrive at the only available conclusion. "What kind of agreement?" he said finally. "A complete one," I said. "The land, the house deed, the brokerage account, all of it restored to my direct, sole ownership, with no secondary authority, no trust structure, no LLC. Clean, documented, filed within 30 days. And if we do that," Michael said carefully, "the legal action, Gerald will advise me on what is and isn't appropriate," I said. "That will depend significantly on whether your cooperation is genuine and complete." Another silence. Michael looked at Julianne. Julianne was looking at the construction paper card on the coffee table. She reached out and touched it with one finger. Just the edge, just barely. The way you touch something you're not sure you have the right to touch anymore. "Daddy," she said. Her voice was wrecked. "I am so sorry. And here is the thing about love. The real kind. The kind that has been tested and survived things and knows its own depth. It doesn't disappear when it's betrayed. It doesn't switch off or burn out or transform neatly into something else. It just stands there, wounded and clear-eyed, waiting to understand what comes next." I looked at my daughter. I thought about Dorothy saying she looks like trouble in a hospital room on a rainy April morning. I thought about a purple crayon and construction paper and a 7-year-old who meant every single word. "I know you are," I said. "I know." The old man stood up. He didn't rage. He didn't beg. He just stood up. Comment below right now. What moment in this act hit you the hardest? Was it the construction paper card? Was it when Julian broke? Was it that single word he said to Michael? Don't. Tell me in the comments. I need to know what you're feeling right now. There is something that happens in the aftermath of a great reckoning that nobody prepares you for. Not the legal resolution. Not the paperwork. Not the filings. Not the 30-day timeline Gerald would oversee with the careful precision of a man who had seen too many of these situations collapse at the finish line to take anything for granted. Not the practical restoration of what had been taken, deed by deed, account by account, acre by acre. I mean, what happens in the silence after the confrontation ends? After Michael has driven away in his silver Mercedes with the tight jaw and the careful eyes of a man recalculating every variable. After Julianne has sat in my living room for another hour, crying in a way I haven't seen since she was a child. The kind of crying that has no strategy in it, no performance, just the raw and unglamorous business of a person coming apart and not being able to stop it. After I have sat across from her and let her cry because some things need to finish themselves before anything new can begin. After all of that, in the quiet of the evening, alone in the house on Clover Ridge Drive, something unexpected happened. I sat in Dorothy's reading chair and I felt, underneath everything, underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the residual ache of what the past 3 weeks had required of me, something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like myself. Not the careful performance of normalcy I had been maintaining. Not the grieving widower. Not the isolated old man. Not the fool who signed everything. Marcus ZAHA, the man who had built something from nothing, who had loved a woman completely and been loved back the same way, who had raised a daughter in a house full of light and Sunday dinners, and the belief that family was the thing worth protecting above all other things. That man, he had apparently been waiting, patient as old timber, for me to remember he was still there. The 30 days that followed were not easy. I want to be honest about that, because this is an honest story. Gerald was meticulous and relentless, and Michael, to his credit or perhaps simply to his self-preservation, cooperated with a thoroughness that suggested he had done his own legal calculus and arrived at the only sensible conclusion. The Miller Creek land was transferred back out of Harborough family holdings and into my name directly within the first 2 weeks. The revocable trust on Clover Ridge Drive was formally dissolved, the deed restored to sole ownership. The brokerage account was unwound from Hargrove Financial's management and re-established in my name at a firm Gerald recommended, a firm with no connection to Michael, no access he could exercise, no provisions he could invoke. Clean, documented, filed. On the day Gerald called to tell me the last piece was in place, I was standing at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the cardinals at Dorothy's feeder. "It's done, Marcus," he said. "All of it, every piece. You're whole again." I stood there for a moment with that word. Whole. It was not quite the right word. I was not the same man I had been in September, before the phone call, before the documents, Before the Sunday dinner where I had smiled across the pot roast at the two people who were planning to take everything from me. That man was gone, and I did not think I could get him back, and I was not entirely sure I wanted to. The man who existed now was something different. Something that had been tested and had not broken. Something harder in some places and, surprisingly, softer in others. "Thank you, Gerald," I said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "There's still the question of the formal complaint to the State Financial Regulatory Board. I want your decision on that before the end of the week." I told him I would think about it. I stood at the window for a long time after the call ended, watching the male cardinal, the bright red one, land on the edge of the feeder and look around with that alert, imperious expression that always made me think of Dorothy. She had loved the cardinals with a particular fierceness, the way she loved anything that was bright and unashamed of it. "What would you do?" I asked her, the way I had been asking her for 4 years, across the silence of a house that still held her shape in every room. The cardinal looked directly at the window for one long moment. Then it went back to eating. Julianne called on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks into the 30 days. Not the warm practice call of the previous months. Something different, hesitant in a way I had not heard from her since she was a teenager. A quality in her voice like someone who has rehearsed something many times and is still not sure it's enough. "Daddy, can I come over? Just me. I need to. I have some things I want to say to you, and I think they need to be said in person." "Come Sunday," I said. "I'll make breakfast." A pause. "Breakfast? Eggs and toast," I said. "The way your mother used to make it." Another pause, longer, and I heard in it the particular weight of a person receiving something they don't feel they've earned. "Okay," she said quietly. Sunday. She arrived at 9 o'clock on a gray November Sunday, the kind of morning that felt like the world was holding its breath between seasons. No Michael, just Julianne, in a coat I hadn't seen before, her hair down, no jewelry, none of the careful assembled presentation she had been wearing for the past year. She looked younger. She looked, in some hard-to-define way, more like herself, or at least more like the person underneath the person she'd been performing. I opened the door and she stood on the porch and looked at me, and I could see she had been crying recently, the particular puffiness around the eyes that doesn't fully resolve overnight. "Come in," I said. "It's cold. I made eggs the way Dorothy used to, scrambled soft, with a little cream, the way Julianne had loved them as a child. Toast with butter. Orange juice in the good glasses, the ones with the small etched pattern around the rim that Dorothy had gotten as a wedding gift and kept for 40 years without breaking a single one." We sat at the kitchen table. Julianne looked at her plate for a moment, and then she looked up at me, and she said, "I don't know how to start." "Start at the beginning," I said. "That's what your mother always told you." Something crossed her face, a flash of grief, quick and bright, like heat lightning. "Mom would be so ashamed of me." "Your mother," I said carefully, "would be heartbroken. Those are different things." She nodded slowly, looked down at her hands. "When Mom died," she said, I didn't handle it. I know that's not an excuse. I'm not offering it as one. But I didn't handle it. I was so angry. At her for leaving. At you for being okay. You seemed okay. You kept doing your routine. You kept getting up at the same time and making your coffee and reading your paper. And I couldn't understand how you were doing that when I felt like the ground had opened up." I set down my fork. "I wasn't okay," I said. "I know that now." Her voice broke slightly. "I know that now, Daddy. But then, I told myself you were fine. I told myself you didn't need me the way I needed you. And then Michael started talking about the assets, about the estate planning, and it felt like action. Like doing something, when I didn't know how to do anything else. And when did action become something else?" I said. She was quiet for a long moment. "Gradually," she said. "That's the honest answer, and I hate it because gradually feels like a lie, like I should have had a moment where I knew. But it was gradual. Michael would reframe something, the land, the account, and at first I'd push back, and he'd explain it differently, and it would sound reasonable, and I wanted it to sound reasonable because the alternative was admitting that I was," she stopped. "Stealing from me," I said. The words sat between us on the kitchen table like something solid. "Yes," she said, barely audible. "Yes, that's what it was." I looked at my daughter. I looked at her for a long time, at the genuine wreckage in her face, at the woman underneath the performance, at the April morning girl who had grown into someone who had lost her way in the particular darkness that sometimes descends on people after they lose the person who kept them pointed toward the light. Dorothy had been that person for Julianne. I understood that now in a way I hadn't before. And when Dorothy died, Julianne had not grieved cleanly. She had grieved sideways, into anger, into distance, into the arms of a man who offered her a direction when she had none, and the direction he offered had led here. That was not an excuse. I held that clearly. But it was an explanation. And explanations, unlike excuses, leave room for something to be done. What is happening with you and Michael? I said. She looked out the kitchen window. I don't know yet. We're talking. I told him that I wouldn't, that there were things I wasn't willing to be, going forward. He's hearing that. A pause. Whether he can actually change, I don't know. But I needed to say it. I nodded slowly. What do you want from me, Julianne? I said. Not what you think I want to hear. What do you actually want? She looked back at me, and her eyes were full. I want to know if there's anything left, she said. Between us. I want to know if I destroyed it completely, or if there's, if you can, if it's possible. She stopped. Pressed her lips together. Started again. I want to know if you can forgive me. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the November morning was gray and still. The cardinal feeder swayed slightly in a wind I couldn't hear through the glass. The rooster clock with the cracked face ticked its patient, unhurried tick. I thought about 42 years. I thought about Dorothy. I thought about the construction paper card with the purple crayon. I thought about standing on this porch on an October morning and feeling the world rearrange itself, and the 11 minutes I had stood there before deciding what kind of man I was going to be about it. I thought about what forgiveness actually was, not the soft, easy, made-for-television version where someone cries and someone else says it's okay, and the music swells, and everything returns to what it was before. That was not forgiveness. That was avoidance wearing forgiveness's coat. Real forgiveness, the kind that costs something, the kind that means anything, was a choice made in full knowledge of what had happened. It was not the erasure of the wound. It was the decision that the wound did not get to be the end of the story. Dorothy had known that. She had forgiven me, across the years of our marriage, for things I am not proud of, moments of pride, moments of absence, the particular selfishness that comes when a man is building something and convinces himself that building it is enough. She had forgiven me not because those things hadn't happened, but because she had decided I was more than the worst of what I had done. I wanted to be the kind of man who could offer my daughter what Dorothy had offered me. Not immediately. Not completely. Not without the work that would need to happen between this kitchen table and whatever came next. But as a beginning, I'm going to tell you something your mother told me once, I said. We'd had a bad stretch, a bad year, actually, when the business was struggling and I was carrying it wrong, and it was affecting everything. And I said to her, I don't know how you stay. I don't know why you don't just leave this. And she said to me, Marcus, I'm not staying because everything is fine. I'm staying because you're worth the trouble of it not being fine. Julianne's tears were falling freely now. She wasn't trying to stop them. I am angry at you, I said. I want to be honest about that. I am hurt in ways that are going to take time to understand fully, and trust is not something I can hand back to you like a key. You'll have to earn it. Not to punish you, but because trust without earning it is just hope wearing trust's clothes, and I am too old and too clear-eyed to do that again. She nodded. She was listening with everything she had. But you are my daughter, I said. You are the best thing your mother and I made together. And I am not willing to let what happened, what you did, what Michael led you into, what you let yourself become, I am not willing to let that be the last word. Not if you're genuinely willing to do the work of making it different. I am, she said. Daddy, I am. Then here's what I need, I said. I need honesty. Complete honesty, going forward, about everything. I need you to disentangle yourself from every financial arrangement Michael built that involved my assets. I need you to speak to Gerald, not through Michael, directly, yourself, and cooperate fully with whatever documentation he needs. And I need time. Not your timeline. Mine. Yes, she said. Whatever you need. All of it. And I need you to understand, I said, that this table, this kitchen, this house, is still your home. It was your mother's home, and it is still yours, and I am not taking that from you. But you come to it differently now. You come to it as someone who understands what it cost, and what it means, and what it requires of you to be worthy of it. She was out of her chair before I finished the sentence. She crossed the small distance between us, and she put her arms around me the way she used to when she was small. Not the careful adult hug of recent years, not the performance hug of Sunday dinners, but something that held nothing back, her face against my shoulder, her whole self in it. And I held her. I held my daughter in Dorothy's kitchen on a gray November morning, and I felt the realness of her. Not the version I had believed in blindly, not the version that had sat across the pot roast calculating her next move, but the actual person, complicated and broken and genuinely sorry and still, underneath it all, mine. "I love you, Daddy," she said into my shoulder. I never stopped. Even when I never stopped. "I know," I said. I never stopped either. We stayed like that for a long time. In the weeks that followed, things did not become simple. I want to be clear about that, because simple would be a lie, and this is not a story built on lies. Julianne met with Gerald twice, without Michael, and cooperated completely. She signed what needed to be signed, confirmed what needed confirming, provided information that strengthened the legal record considerably. She did it without being asked twice, without hedging, without the careful management that had characterized the previous 18 months. She did it like a person paying a debt they know they owe. Michael, I will say this for him, also cooperated. Whether from genuine remorse or simply from the recognition that the alternative was considerably worse, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that he did what was required, completely and on schedule, and that in a subsequent conversation at Gerald's office, he said something that surprised me. He said, "I knew it was wrong. I want you to know that I knew." I looked at him across Gerald's conference table, and I said, "I know you did. That's why it mattered." There was no warmth between us after that. There may never be, and I am at peace with that. There are relationships that can be repaired, and there are relationships that can be made functional, and the wisdom is in knowing the difference. Michael and I would be functional, civil, present at the same table for Julianne's sake. That was what was possible, and I chose to find it sufficient. As for the regulatory complaint, I discussed it at length with Gerald, and in the end I chose not to file. Not because what Michael had done was minor, but because the legal restoration was complete, and because I was not willing to spend whatever years I had remaining defined by the prosecution of a wound. Gerald thought I was being too generous. I told him I was being strategic, that the most powerful thing I could do was demonstrate that I had not been diminished by what had happened to me, and that diminishment and dismissal were two very different responses. He said, "Dorothy would have said the same thing." "I know," I said. "That's where I learned it." On the first Saturday in December, Julianne came over, and we did something we had not done since Dorothy died. We put up the Christmas tree. It is a real tree. I have never had a fake one, and I never will, because Dorothy believed that anything worth having should cost you something, and a real tree costs you the needles, and the water, and the careful attention. We drove to the lot on Route 9, the same lot we had gone to every year for 30 years, run now by the grandson of the man who had run it when Julianne was small. We walked the rows in the cold, our breath making small clouds in the December air, and Julianne pointed at trees, and I evaluated them with the gravity of a man who takes Christmas trees seriously, which I do. And we argued mildly about height versus fullness, and whether the gap on the left side of a particular Douglas fir was a problem or gave it character, and at some point I realized that I was laughing. Not performing contentment. Actually laughing. We brought the tree home. We set it up in the living room in the same stand Dorothy had bought at a hardware store in 1994, the good stand, the one that actually holds water properly. We put on the lights, the old-fashioned kind, the ones with the large warm bulbs, because Dorothy had hated the cold LED lights, and I had voted with her even after she was gone. And then Julianne opened the ornament boxes. We had not opened the ornament boxes since the last Christmas Dorothy was well enough to decorate. For years they had sat in the spare room, taped shut, another thing I hadn't been able to face. Julianne opened the first one and held up a small ceramic handprint, her handprint, from kindergarten, painted red with Julianne, age 5 written on the back in Dorothy's handwriting. She looked at it for a long moment. "She kept everything," Julianne said softly. "Everything," I confirmed. We hung the ornaments one by one, and with each one there was a story. This one from a vacation in 1995. This one Dorothy had made herself from a kit she'd bought at a craft fair. This one Julianne had given us the first Christmas she'd had her own income and wanted to contribute something she'd paid for herself. The tree filled up slowly, each ornament a small act of remembering, and the living room filled up with the smell of pine and warm lights and something that felt, tentatively and imperfectly, but unmistakably, like home. When the last ornament was hung, the star at the top, the one Dorothy had placed every year, which I had not touched since she placed it last, I held it out to Julianne. She shook her head. "You do it, Daddy." "I've been doing it alone for 4 years," I said. "I think it's time we did it together." She looked at me for a moment with Dorothy's eyes. Then she took the star in both hands, and I steadied the ladder, and she climbed up and placed it at the top of the tree, and I held the ladder and looked up at my daughter and thought about rainy April mornings and construction paper cards, and the particular stubborn persistence of love that survives things it has no logical reason to survive. She climbed down and stood beside me, and we looked at the tree together. "It's good," I said. "It's really good," she said. We stood there in the light of it for a while, not saying anything, because some moments are large enough that words would only crowd them. I am Mr. ZAHA, and I am 68 years old. I wake up every morning at 5:47. My joints crack like old timber. I make coffee in the same percolator Dorothy and I bought at a Sears in 1987. I drink it black at the kitchen window, watching the sun come up over the ridge. But here is what is different now. I watch the sun come up and I know, not believe, not hope, but know, exactly who I am and exactly what I have. I know that the 40 acres on Miller Creek Road belong to me, and I know the deed to this house has my name on it, and only my name. I know that what I built over 41 years is intact, secured, protected by something stronger now than documents or signatures. Protected by the knowledge that I faced the worst thing, and I didn't break, and I didn't become bitter, and I didn't let it take from me the thing it was actually after. Not the land, not the house, not the money, but the man. Julianne calls on Thursdays. She comes for Sunday dinners when she can. It is different than before, quieter in some ways, more careful, the careful of something being rebuilt with attention rather than the careless ease of something assumed. We are learning each other again, from a different place, and some weeks are better than others. And I have made my peace with the pace of it, because I am old enough to know that anything worth having is worth the time it takes to rebuild it right. Michael is present at the table when he comes. We speak. We are civil. I watch him with clear eyes and I believe, cautiously, that some part of the reckoning reached something in him, though I hold that belief loosely and intend to keep holding it that way. Gerald came for Christmas dinner and ate 2 helpings of pot roast, and told me 3 times that the case had been the most satisfying work of his semi-retirement. I told him to stop semi-retiring and just retire properly, and he told me to mind my own business, and we laughed, and it was good. On Christmas morning, I walked the yard in the early light, coffee in hand, the December air cold and clean and sharp with the smell of frost and pine. I walked to the big oak at the corner, Dorothy's old man tree, and I put my hand on its bark, the way I had always done, the way she had taught me to do, her theory being that old trees had been standing through worse than whatever you were currently facing, and it was worth acknowledging that. The bark was cold and rough and absolutely solid under my hand. I thought about what Gerald had said when the last document was filed, when everything had been restored. "You're whole again." Not quite right, I had thought then. But standing in the December yard with my hand on that old tree, I revised my answer. Whole was not the right word because it implied a return to what I had been before, and I was not that man anymore, and I did not want to be. That man had been loving and generous and completely exposed. This man was loving and generous and clear-eyed, and the difference between those two things was everything. I was not whole. I was better. I was a 68-year-old man who had been a fool in the best possible way, not stupid, not weak, but human. A man who had loved his daughter so much that he had signed anything she put in front of him, and who had paid for that love with a season of loss and a reckoning that had cost him more than he could easily account for. And I had come through it, not unchanged, not undamaged, not pretending the wound wasn't real or that the scar wouldn't show, but through it, standing on the other side of the worst thing, with my house still under my feet, and my name still on the deed, and my daughter still in my life, and Dorothy's cardinal feeder still full of seed, and the rooster clock still ticking with its cracked face in the kitchen. Standing on the other side of all of it, still myself, still Marcus ZAHA, still here. The Cardinals came back that morning, both of them, the bright red male and the quiet brown female, and they landed together on the feeder and 8 in the December light, and I stood in the yard and watched them and thought, Dorothy, you would have loved how this turned out. I think she heard me. I think she always does. Mr. ZAHA didn't just get his house back. He got himself back. And that is the greatest victory of all. Comment below right now, what part of this story stayed with you the most? Was it the construction paper card? The Christmas tree? The moment he held his daughter in that kitchen? Or was it something else entirely? Something that reminded you of your own life, your own family, your own moment of reckoning? Drop it in the comments. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.